When a decorated black police officer was pulled over by his own fellow white cops, he thought it was just a routine stop, but what followed turned into one of the most shocking racial profiling cases the department had ever seen. Marcus Johnson had been a police officer for nearly 10 years, and in that time he had seen just about everything the streets had to offer. From tense standoffs with armed suspects to quiet moments of helping lost children find their way home, his badge carried the weight of experience and responsibility. But on that particular evening, as he drove home after a long shift, Marcus found himself in a situation he had never imagined he would face, one that would test his patience, his dignity, and his very belief in the system he had sworn to serve. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the streets bathed in the glow of street lamps and the occasional flicker of neon signs. Marcus was tired, the kind of tired that settled deep in his bones after a 12-hour day. He wasn't in uniform anymore. Instead, he wore a plain gray shirt and dark jeans, his badge tucked safely inside his wallet, resting in his back pocket. His service weapon was holstered discreetly at his side, as always when he was off duty. He drove his black sedan, not a flashy car but dependable, much like him. Traffic was light as he turned down a quieter stretch of road, just a few blocks from his neighborhood. The thought of a hot shower and a warm meal waiting at home made him exhale with relief. Then, in his rearview mirror, he saw it, flashing red and blue lights cutting through the night. The familiar sight that usually gave him a sense of authority and purpose suddenly sent a chill down his spine. Marcus slowed, signaled, and carefully pulled his car over to the curb. His training told him to stay calm, to keep his hands visible, and to wait for the officers to approach. He knew the routine better than anyone. But this time he was on the other side of it, and that made all the difference. The cruiser pulled up behind him, its headlights glaring into his rear window. Two white officers stepped out, their silhouettes sharp against the beams. Marcus could see the way their hands hovered near their holstered guns, tense and ready. That single detail unsettled him. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run a red light, hadn't done anything to warrant such suspicion. He rolled down his window as they approached. "Evening, officers," Marcus said evenly, his voice calm but firm. He wanted to defuse the tension before it spiraled. "License and registration," one of them barked. The tone wasn't polite or professional, it was edged with hostility. "Of course," Marcus replied. He reached slowly for his wallet, moving deliberately so they could see his hands. Years of training told him sudden movements could be misinterpreted, especially in situations charged with suspicion. He retrieved his driver's license and handed it over, then leaned across to grab his registration from the glove compartment. As he passed the documents through the window, the second officer circled the car, shining his flashlight across the interior. The beam lingered on the holster at Marcus's side. "What's that?" the officer demanded sharply. Marcus kept his eyes steady. "My service weapon. I'm a police officer. Badge is right here in my wallet." He gestured toward it calmly. The first officer took the license, glanced at it, and frowned. "Officer, huh? Out here in this car? You sure about that?" His words dripped with doubt, as if Marcus had fabricated his entire identity. Marcus felt a flicker of disbelief. He had expected questions, maybe even irritation, but the outright dismissal of his badge and career cut deeper than he wanted to admit. He kept his composure, though, reminding himself that losing his temper could only make things worse. "Yes," Marcus said firmly. 10 years with the department. If you call dispatch, they'll confirm it." But the officers weren't interested in confirmation. The second one ordered him, "Step out of the car. Now." Marcus hesitated for a second, then opened the door and stepped onto the curb. The night air was cool, but heat rose in his chest. He had been in plenty of stops where suspects grew defensive or combative, but this was different. He wasn't a suspect. He was one of them. Yet here he was, treated like a criminal on the side of the road, under the cold gaze of men who wore the same uniform he did. "Hands on the hood," one officer commanded. Marcus clenched his jaw but obeyed. He spread his palms against the cool metal, staring at his reflection in the windshield. A decorated officer, a man who had given a decade of his life to protecting the city, now standing with his hands splayed like a common offender. One of the officers began patting him down roughly, ignoring Marcus's attempts to calmly explain. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said evenly, though inside his patience was thinning. "I've identified myself. My badge is right there in my wallet. Call it in." But they didn't. Instead, they muttered about suspicious vehicles and not belonging in this neighborhood. The word struck Marcus harder than the rough search. Not belonging. It was something he had heard whispered in other contexts, but never from fellow officers. It was a phrase that reduced his years of service, his oath, his identity, to nothing more than the color of his skin. As the minutes dragged on, Marcus felt a mix of humiliation and quiet fury. He thought of the irony. How many times had he told young black men to stay calm during stops, to cooperate, to avoid escalation? He had believed that compliance would keep them safe. Now, standing here with his hands on the hood, he wasn't so sure. The street was silent except for the crackle of the officers' radios. A couple of pedestrians slowed as they passed, glancing curiously at the scene before moving on. Marcus's stomach turned. To them, he didn't look like an officer heading home after a long day. He looked like another man in handcuffs waiting to be taken away. When the officers finally stepped back, they hadn't apologized. They hadn't explained. They hadn't even acknowledged his badge. They simply told him to watch himself, and walked back to their cruiser. The lights disappeared into the night, leaving Marcus alone on the side of the road, his car idling in the glow of the street lamp. He slid back into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly. His reflection in the rearview mirror looked weary, but behind his eyes was a growing fire. What had just happened wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was a violation, a wound that went deeper than any physical blow. And as he drove the rest of the way home, Marcus knew this night would change everything. The next day, Marcus Johnson tried to push the incident from his mind. He told himself it was just a mistake, an unfortunate misunderstanding that would fade with time. But the truth was harder to ignore. The way those officers had looked at him, the suspicion in their voices, the roughness in their search, none of it had been about a traffic violation. It had been about him. About the color of his skin. And no matter how many times he replayed the scene in his mind, he couldn't escape the sting of humiliation. That night, when he slid behind the wheel again, the memory of flashing lights in his mirror returned with an almost physical weight. His chest tightened. He thought about how many people in his community lived with that same weight every day, the constant fear of being pulled over, accused, or treated as less than human. He had worn the badge for a decade, and yet in one encounter, his colleagues had stripped him of the very identity he thought protected him. But Marcus's nightmare wasn't over. Just 2 nights later it happened again. He was driving back from visiting his sister's house, a quiet residential area where families walked dogs and kids rode bikes until dusk. The streets were calm, but as he made a slow turn, headlights appeared behind him. Moments later, the familiar flash of red and blue filled his mirror. His stomach dropped. Pulling over, Marcus took a deep breath. He placed both hands firmly on the steering wheel, the way he had advised countless young men to do in community meetings. He rolled down the window before the officers even reached him. His pulse thudded in his ears as the 2 white officers approached, their boots heavy on the pavement. One leaned down, his flashlight shining directly into Marcus's face. License and registration. Marcus kept his tone steady. Of course. May I ask why I was pulled over, officer? You looked suspicious driving through this neighborhood, the officer replied flatly, as if the explanation required no further detail. Marcus swallowed his frustration. Suspicious how? Don't get smart with me. Just hand over your license. Marcus retrieved his wallet slowly, handing over his license. I'm an officer with the department. My badge is right here if you'd like to see it. The officer's lip curled. We'll see about that. The second officer moved around the car, his flashlight scanning inside again. He paused at Marcus's holster. Step out of the vehicle. Now. Marcus's jaw tightened. He wanted to protest, to demand a reason, but he knew too well how quickly a roadside stop could spiral. He opened the door and stepped out, his movements deliberate and calm. The cool night air brushed against his skin, but all he felt was heat rising inside him. Hands on the hood, the first officer ordered. Marcus complied, laying his palms against the cold surface. He could see his reflection in the windshield again just as before. A black man, tired and weary, treated like a suspect in the very city he swore to protect. The second officer began a rough pat-down. What are you doing around here? He demanded. I told you, Marcus said, forcing patience into his tone. I'm a police officer. I was visiting family nearby. Sure you were. The officer snorted. A lot of people claim to be cops when they get caught doing something shady. The words cut Marcus deeply. Shady. Suspicious. Not belonging. He heard the same labels recycled as if his very presence was a crime. The humiliation gnawed at him, but worse was the knowledge that no amount of compliance seemed to matter. He was an officer, he was polite, he was calm, yet none of it changed the way they treated him. A small crowd began to gather again. Neighbors peeked out from porches, some pulling out phones recording the encounter. Marcus felt a wave of shame. He had always believed that if people saw the full truth, if they understood how police worked, they would trust the system more. But tonight he was the example of everything broken in that system. The officer leaned closer, sneering. "You're resisting, you know that? Keep this up and you'll be in cuffs." Marcus took a steadying breath. He thought about his training, about de-escalation techniques, about every lecture he had given younger recruits on professionalism. He wanted to shout, to demand respect, but instead he said, "I'm not resisting. I'm cooperating fully. All I'm asking is that you confirm my badge." But they didn't. They laughed quietly, dismissing his words. To them he wasn't a colleague. He wasn't even a man with rights. He was simply another black body under suspicion. Minutes passed like hours until finally, without explanation, they pulled back. "Watch yourself," one officer muttered. "You don't belong around here at night." With that, they walked away, leaving Marcus standing in the glow of the streetlight, his dignity battered once again. He slid back into his car, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the wheel. The words echoed in his mind, "You don't belong." For years he had dedicated his life to belonging, to being part of the department, to serving the city with honor. But in the eyes of those officers, none of it mattered. His skin spoke louder than his service. As he drove away, Marcus felt something shift inside him. This wasn't just about his pride or his safety anymore. This was about truth. If this could happen to him, an officer, a man who knew the rules, who carried the badge, then what chance did ordinary citizens have? By the time he pulled into his driveway, the decision had crystallized in his mind. He would not stay silent. He would not let them sweep this under the rug. What happened on that roadside was more than a mistake. It was a symptom of something rotten, something that had been allowed to grow unchecked in the very institution he called his own. Marcus sat in his car for a long moment, staring at the quiet house before him. He thought of his parents, of his sister, of the young boys in the community who looked up to him. He thought of the badge he had once been so proud to wear. And he realized that if he wanted change, real change, he would have to fight for it. That night, Marcus walked inside with his mind made up. The time for patience was over. The time for silence was done. What had begun as accusations on the roadside was about to become a battle that reached far beyond the glow of flashing lights. The days after the second stop weighed heavily on Marcus Johnson. He moved through his routine at the precinct like a shadow of himself, present in body but distant in thought. His colleagues joked around, filed reports, and talked about weekend plans, but Marcus felt the weight of a truth none of them seemed to acknowledge. He had been one of them for 10 years, but after 2 humiliating roadside encounters, he no longer felt like he truly belonged. The first time he was stopped, he had tried to convince himself it was a mistake. The second time stripped away that illusion. Twice in the span of a week, he had been treated like a suspect, accused of not belonging and forced to prove his worth, not to strangers on the street, but to fellow officers wearing the same badge he carried. That realization sat like a stone in his chest. He replayed every detail in his head, the dismissive tones, the accusations, the cold demand to put his hands on the hood. It wasn't about traffic violations. It wasn't about suspicious driving. It was about race. And for the first time, Marcus felt the full weight of what so many black men in his community had told him over the years, that no matter how much you achieved, no matter how spotless your record, your skin could strip it all away in an instant. One afternoon, Marcus was sitting at his desk when he overheard 2 officers talking near the coffee machine. They were laughing about a stop they'd made earlier in the week, joking about how some people never learned to stay in their place. The words made Marcus's blood run cold. He didn't know if they were talking about him, but the phrasing hit too close to home. His hands clenched into fists beneath the desk, nails biting into his palms. That evening, as Marcus drove home, he noticed something different in himself. The nervousness he had felt before, the sinking fear of flashing lights in his mirror, was gone. It had been replaced by something stronger, something sharper, anger. Not the kind of reckless anger that clouded judgment, but a focused, deliberate fire. He was tired of being humiliated. Tired of swallowing his pride. Tired of pretending that silence would make the problem go away. When he pulled into his driveway, his sister Denise was waiting for him on the porch. She had heard about the stops. Neighbors had recorded them, and videos had already begun circulating online. "Marcus," she said softly as he walked up, "how much longer are you going to let them do this to you?" Her words pierced him deeper than he expected. Marcus prided himself on being the protector of his family, the one who kept trouble away. But now, it was his name, his face, being shared online as another example of police targeting a black man. And the cruelest part was that he wasn't just any man, he was supposed to be one of their own. Denise touched his arm. You always told me to speak up when something isn't right. To never let anyone make me feel small. So why are you letting them do it to you? Marcus met her gaze, and for a moment he saw the reflection of his younger self, the kid who had dreamed of wearing a badge to make a difference. That boy had believed he could bridge the gap between law enforcement and his community. That boy had believed he could change the system from within. But the man standing here now was faced with a bitter truth. The system wasn't interested in changing for him. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the words "you don't belong here" echoing in his head. He thought of the countless black men who had been told the same thing in different ways on different nights. He thought of the names in the headlines, the protests, the marches, the grieving families. And he thought of himself, standing on the roadside, humiliated, ignored, dismissed by the very people who should have trusted him. At some point, Marcus sat up, swung his legs over the bed, and pulled out a notebook from his nightstand. He began to write. At first, it was just notes, dates, times, what was said, who was present. But as the words spilled onto the pages, they turned into something more. A testimony, a record, a weapon. By dawn, Marcus had filled half the notebook. His hand ached, but his mind felt clearer than it had in days. He realized something undeniable. Silence had protected his colleagues, not him. Silence had allowed them to believe they could treat him, and others, with impunity. And if he kept silent, nothing would change. When he walked into the precinct that morning, Marcus felt different. The fatigue was still there, but beneath it pulsed determination. He saw the officers laughing, carrying on as usual, but he no longer felt like an outsider shrinking in shame. He felt like a man preparing for a fight. That evening, after his shift, Marcus made a decision. He contacted a civil rights attorney. The words felt heavy as he spoke them over the phone, recounting his story. But with each detail he shared, the weight lifted slightly. The attorney listened carefully, asked pointed questions, and finally said, "Officer Johnson, if what you're telling me is accurate, you have a strong case. This isn't just profiling. This is a violation of your rights." Marcus hung up the phone with his heart pounding. For the first time since the stops began, he felt control returning to him. The fear that had once silenced him was gone. The humiliation that had weighed him down was transforming into resolve. As he sat at his kitchen table that night, Marcus realized he had reached the breaking point. Not the kind that crushed him, but the kind that pushed him forward. He would no longer be the quiet officer swallowing indignities. He would be the man who stood up, not just for himself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The road ahead would not be easy. Marcus knew lawsuits were messy, that departments closed ranks, that colleagues might turn their backs. But he also knew one thing with absolute certainty. Justice was worth the fight. And as he closed his notebook, Marcus whispered to himself, "No more silence." Filing the lawsuit was like stepping into a storm. The moment Marcus Johnson's name appeared on the legal documents, the weight of the department shifted against him. At first, there was silence. No one mentioned it directly, but he could feel the tension in every hallway he walked through. Conversations hushed when he entered the room. Colleagues who once slapped him on the back avoided his gaze. The brotherhood of the badge, the bond he had believed in for years, suddenly felt like an illusion. Marcus had expected pushback, but the coldness stung more than he anticipated. Still, he reminded himself why he had taken this step. 2 humiliating traffic stops. 2 blatant examples of racial profiling. If this could happen to him, a decorated officer, then no one was safe. Filing the lawsuit wasn't just about reclaiming his dignity, it was about forcing the system to acknowledge what it had spent years denying. The city's legal team moved quickly, releasing a statement to the press. They called the incidents misunderstandings and isolated events, insisting that the officers involved had acted according to protocol. Reading those words, Marcus felt his stomach turn. How easily they dismissed his truth, how casually they swept away the trauma of being treated like a criminal by his own peers. The media, however, latched onto the story. Headlines blared across newspapers and television screens. Black police officer sues his own department for racial profiling. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Some people were outraged on his behalf, seeing his case as undeniable proof of systemic bias. Others accused him of betraying the force, of washing the department's dirty laundry in public. Marcus learned quickly how polarized the world could become when truth challenged power. The first time Marcus stepped into the courtroom, the atmosphere pressed down on him like a physical weight. The judge sat stern and composed, the attorneys traded sharp words, and behind him rows of journalists and community members watched closely. Marcus adjusted his tie, sitting upright, determined to project the strength he sometimes doubted he still possessed. He wasn't just Marcus Johnson here. He was a symbol of every black man who had ever been stopped, doubted, or humiliated without reason. His attorney, a sharp and steady woman named Angela Price, laid out the case methodically. She described the traffic stops in detail, presenting the dates, the officers' names, and the dismissive words they had spoken. She pointed to the videos captured by bystanders, each one showing Marcus's calm cooperation and the officer's aggressive handling of the situation. In the courtroom, there was no way to deny what the footage revealed. The city's defense tried to poke holes. They suggested Marcus had been emotional after long shifts. They argued that the officers were simply following safety procedures when they saw a firearm in his vehicle. They even hinted that Marcus had exaggerated the story for personal gain. Each claim felt like a knife, but Marcus refused to flinch. He sat steady, staring straight ahead, his silence a shield against their attempts to undermine him. When it came time for Marcus to testify, the courtroom grew still. He walked to the witness stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Sitting there under the gaze of the judge and jury, he felt exposed but also empowered. This was his chance to speak the words that had been burning inside him since that first stop. He told them how it felt to be pulled over without cause, to be treated as suspicious in a neighborhood where he had family. He described the humiliation of having his badge dismissed as if it were a toy, of being ordered onto the hood of his car while bystanders recorded. He spoke about the sting of hearing the words, "You don't belong here," from fellow officers, words that cut deeper than any insult he had heard from strangers on the street. As Marcus spoke, he saw members of the jury shifting uncomfortably, their expressions reflecting a mixture of shock and empathy. He knew not all of them would understand, but he hoped they would feel the truth in his voice. Outside the courthouse, the case ignited protests and rallies. Community leaders praised Marcus for his courage, calling him a trailblazer who dared to challenge the institution from within. But the backlash was just as fierce. Anonymous messages flooded his phone, some calling him a hero, others calling him a traitor. He received cold stares in the precinct, overheard whispers branding him a troublemaker. The Brotherhood had become a wall, and Marcus was on the outside. Through it all, Denise stood by his side. She attended every hearing, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. "You're not just fighting for yourself," she reminded him. "You're fighting for all of us." As the trial dragged on, Marcus began to see the cracks forming in the department's defense. Under cross-examination, one of the officers admitted he never called dispatch to confirm Marcus's identity. Another hesitated when asked to justify why Marcus had been stopped at all, eventually conceding there had been no clear violation. Those small admissions, combined with the damning video evidence, shifted the momentum in Marcus's favor. Each day in court drained him, but it also fueled him. He realized the lawsuit was no longer just about winning damages or clearing his name. It was about exposing a truth the department had tried to bury. And whether he won or lost, the truth was already out there, rippling through the community, sparking conversations that could no longer be silenced. On the final day of testimony, Marcus looked around the packed courtroom. He saw faces of strangers who believed in him, reporters scribbling notes, and officers sitting stiffly in uniform. He felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of his pain, his anger, and his resolve. When the judge called for recess, Marcus exhaled deeply. The fight was far from over, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He had done the right thing. For himself, for his family, for every person who had ever felt invisible on the roadside, he had stood up. And as he walked out of the courtroom that day, surrounded by flashing cameras and raised voices, Marcus understood something profound. The lawsuit wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. The day the verdict was announced, the courthouse overflowed with tension. Supporters gathered outside with handmade signs demanding justice, while skeptics muttered that Marcus Johnson had gone too far in challenging his own department. Inside, the air was thick with anticipation. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped tightly together, every muscle in his body rigid. 10 years of service, 2 humiliating stops, weeks of testimony, it all came down to this moment. When the judge re-entered the courtroom and the jury filed in, Marcus's heart pounded. The foreperson stood, holding a sheet of paper that seemed to carry the weight of the world. The silence was deafening as the words were read aloud. The jury had found in Marcus's favor. The officers had indeed engaged in racial profiling, and the department had violated his civil rights. For a heartbeat, Marcus couldn't breathe. Relief crashed over him like a tidal wave, and a low murmur rippled through the courtroom. His attorney, Angela Price, placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Denise, sitting just behind him, wiped tears from her eyes. For Marcus, the victory wasn't about the financial damages the court ordered the department to pay. It was about validation. For once, the truth had not been denied or buried. For once, the system had admitted it was wrong. Outside, the scene erupted. Reporters shoved microphones forward, demanding statements. Supporters cheered, chanting his name, while opponents shouted insults. Marcus stepped out into the chaos, the cameras flashing relentlessly, and raised his hand for silence. When the noise settled slightly, he spoke. "This case was never just about me," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "It was about every person who has ever been stopped, searched, or humiliated simply because of the color of their skin. It was about proving that silence will not protect us, but courage can bring change. I wore the badge with pride for 10 years, but that badge didn't protect me from profiling. Today, this verdict proves that no one is above accountability, not even those in uniform." His words spread like wildfire, repeated across news broadcasts, shared on social media, and echoed in community meetings across the city. People saw in Marcus not just a man who had endured injustice, but a symbol of resistance and resilience. The department, under intense public scrutiny, scrambled to respond. The chief of police announced mandatory racial bias training for all officers and promised sweeping reforms to rebuild trust with the community. Cynics doubted the sincerity of those promises, but Marcus knew the verdict had forced their hand. For the first time, the department could not dismiss racial profiling as isolated. The court had made it undeniable. Yet victory came with a price. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was colder than ever. Some officers glared at Marcus when he passed. Others refused to speak to him altogether, treating him like a traitor who had broken the unwritten code of silence. But Marcus no longer carried shame. He walked those halls with his head high, knowing he had stood for something greater than acceptance. One evening, a young black recruit approached him quietly in the locker room. "Officer Johnson," he said nervously, "I just wanted to thank you. What you did, it makes me believe things can actually change." His words caught Marcus off guard. For the first time since the lawsuit began, Marcus felt hope blooming. Maybe his fight wasn't just about his own dignity, but about paving a path for those who came after him. The weeks turned into months, and while the scars of that night on the roadside never fully faded, Marcus found peace in knowing he had transformed pain into purpose. He continued to serve, but with a deeper understanding of the weight he carried, not just as an officer, but as a black man determined to bridge a broken trust. One Sunday afternoon, Marcus visited his parents' home. His father, once skeptical of his choice to sue, clapped him on the shoulder with pride. His mother hugged him tightly, whispering, "You've made us proud, baby. You've made us all proud." At dinner, his niece asked, "Uncle Marcus, are you a hero now?" He smiled softly and replied, "I'm just someone who didn't stay quiet when it mattered." The world didn't change overnight. There were still reports of profiling, still protests, still moments that reminded Marcus how deep the roots of prejudice ran. But his case had set a precedent. Departments across the state began reviewing policies, officers were reminded that accountability was not optional, and communities felt a spark of empowerment. Marcus often thought back to the words that had haunted him. "You don't belong here." They had been meant to diminish him, to strip away his humanity. But now he realized they had pushed him to fight harder, to claim his place not only in the department but in the larger struggle for justice. On the anniversary of his victory, Marcus stood once again before a crowd at a community event. The night air was cool, the same kind of night when his life had been upended by flashing lights. He looked at the faces gathered, young, old, black, white, and felt a deep sense of purpose. "I can't promise the fight is over," he told them. "But I can promise this. Every time we speak out, every time we demand justice, every time we refuse to accept silence, we move one step closer to the world we deserve." Change doesn't happen all at once. It happens when ordinary people decide enough is enough. As the applause rose around him, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: belonging. Not because of the badge, not because of a courtroom victory, but because he had chosen to stand for truth when it mattered most. The road ahead was still long, but Marcus no longer feared it. He had walked through humiliation, through anger, through the breaking point, and emerged stronger. His story had become a spark, and he knew sparks could ignite flames that lit the way for others. And as he stepped down from the stage, greeted by embraces and gratitude, Marcus realized the fight had given him more than justice. It had given him purpose. His battle was over, but the movement it inspired had only just begun.